This is a global skills podcast, conversations that shape the future of work and learning. We're exploring how we close the skills gap and build a future where everyone has the chance to thrive. From education to business, connecting people, ideas, and opportunities that drive change. It's about collaboration, curiosity, and creating real impact today. Because every skill learned brings us one step closer to a more inclusive world. The Global Skills Podcast, where learning and opportunity come together. Welcome to the Global Skills Podcast. Today we have Cheney Hamilton, who is an award-winning workforce strategist and lead analyst for Fusion Work and Bloor Research. Recognized for redefining how we govern AI's impact for people, productivity, and the economy. Her work tackles a critical but overlooked risk, the threat AI poses to labour income cycles and long-term economic stability. At the intersection of labour economics, policy, and AI governance, she's leading the charge to establish workforce sustainability as the essential fourth pillar of ESG. With the landmark white paper launching at Westminster in 2026, Cheney is shaping the frameworks that will guide responsible AI adoption for organisations and regulators worldwide. Cheney, you're so welcome to the Global Skills Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Vanessa. It's lovely to be here.
So let's start off with a little bit about you and really how you ended up in the career that you're in.
Well, not to go too much into it, it was kind of by accident. Like for most women out there, I guess I had a very normal career prior to having babies. Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 was never an issue. Conforming was not a problem. And I don't really think I thought about any other way of working. Then in 2014, I was 33. I had my first baby and she was born with hip dysplasia. And before that, the plan was always to go back to work after about 5 months. My husband was going to take shared parental leave. He was the first guy in his company to do that. And because she had the hip dysplasia, that pretty much meant she was in a full body cast for the first 15 months of her life. It put us, I guess, in our very own version of lockdown many years before COVID happened. And we struggled emotionally. We struggled in lots of ways. It was a very difficult period for us. But I think what it did do was give us our first experience of what flexible working could be. Both of us, our employers were so supportive with us throughout it all. Having said that, a couple of years later, when we had our second daughter, Eliza, our employers were kind of not as forthcoming with the flexibility because by that point we had 2 healthy children and we would be setting precedents in our offices that were not set when we had an unwell child, shall we say. That took me on a journey to launch mummy jobs and daddy jobs, and I became one of the flexible working ambassadors and influencers in the UK back in sort of 2017 when it first all went live. And I think one of the things that kind of differentiated me from the other flexible working influencers out there at the time was that I very quickly came to realize that actually there's nothing flexible about flexible working, that however you frame policy or guidance is always going to be inflexible whilst we monetize ourselves by time. Then we had COVID-19, then we had the advent of AI, and that kind of pushed me to belief that actually we shouldn't be monetized by time. We need to be monetized by outcomes because AI is going to eat all of our tasks for breakfast. AI completely gives businesses the ability to design work to outputs, but we were not doing the same thing for our human beings in terms of designing work for us that's outcome-based, all task-based, which really just put every single person on the planet at risk of redundancy, kind of giving shareholders that opportunity to see actually we can make loads of additional revenue and not have the headcount. And I just could foresee a vicious cycle. Chatting to Richard Skellett, who is the chairman of Bloor Research International, and we started talking about outcome-based working. He spoke to me about mutable operating models. Eventually, we started talking about the potential for fusion work. And I guess from there, the rest is history. I joined the APPG for the future of work. And because that was so technology heavy, I wanted to be somewhere that actually looked at the impact on people. So I joined the APPG for modernising employment as well. And it's really, while I've been sat there, while we've been looking at AI and I've been asked to go in and do keynotes and give advice to Parliament, that really this whole fusion work white paper has come about. Now I'm literally in the thick of it because we've just been given a date of the 6th of January to release it, which when you've got Christmas and New Year in the middle of that is not a lot of time.
I mean, it's fascinating how you fell into it. And I can relate a little bit when first went remote working, I fell ill and I couldn't commute, but my brain was fine. Like I could
Yeah.
speak. And this was going back to 2010. And I remember looking to going, where are the flexible jobs? And then thinking, wow, I was a former recruiter. I used to run an agency. I thought there must be other people like you and I
Mhm.
who need more flexibility. But you
Yeah.
are right, like flexibility in its true sense. The hour, it's gone back to that Henry Ford model, but we've
Mhm.
evolved so much, haven't we?
Absolutely. And like I say, all we're asking for with the current flexible working legislation is literally that the non-conforming contracts, but they're still time-based. So if you're only allowed to make a flex request once or twice a year, but your contract is 10 till 2, but what happens next week when something happens in your life where you need to adjust that and you can't? So where's the flexibility? There's nothing flexible about flexible working if it's designed around time. And that was kind of my point.
Let's look at AI now from the perspective of challenges or problems that companies are currently facing or that are likely to come on if they don't start really planning for 2026 and beyond. What do you think are the biggest challenges and problems companies are facing now or that they don't even know about?
A lot of it's coming off the back of FOMO from what I see at the moment, that fear of missing out, adopting without design. It's a huge red flag for me because we don't do it in any other part of how we design our businesses. When we have our transformation projects and things like that, these things can take years but from getting to A to B. And don't get me wrong, I don't believe in transformation. I believe in adopting a mutable enterprise, which is the art of staying in that constant state of reinvention, because obviously transformations fail or you get from A to B and actually we've moved on now. We need to get to C, we need to get to D. So you're constantly going through that cycle anyway. So why not actually just design your organization to be like that? But back to AI. What I'm seeing is, I guess, part and parcel of that. People are just adopting AI and they're bolting it onto systems within our organizations that are already broken, that already showcase their bias. There's no framework around data. Governments have been quite slow on the whole governance around AI. I know the ICO is trying to get involved, and we've obviously got the EU AI Act coming up. But to me, it just feels like it's all very bitty. And so when companies are plugging them in, you end up in situations like we're seeing with Workday, where somebody's accused them of showing bias that because they're disabled and because historically the people that they've hired have not been disabled, that data has fed the AI machine and then AI has magnified that by millions because it operates at machine speed. And the breakdown is that, well, actually, historically, you've never hired these people, so I'm not going to look to bring these people in now. I'm going to go off your historic data, magnify it to the nth degree, and base all my opt out decision making or whatever it is based on your historically biased data. And I think that's what people don't really understand with AI. I think they see it as a tool, but it is not a tool. A tool is something that you pick up and use. You know, AI is a force multiplier. That's how I refer to it. It's the systemic piece that sits around it. It's what the tool sits within. It is not a tool. And I think the whole time people look at them like a tool, they're going to adopt it in the wrong way and it's going to cause them nothing but problems. And we will see those apocalyptic declines that people have been talking about. That will happen if we don't start designing AI in properly and using it properly. I mean, for me personally, I see AI as like an apprentice. It's not an off the shelf product. It's something that comes in that has a little bit of knowledge or a lot of knowledge, but really needs to be molded into what to do with it. It takes time, it takes input, and you need to monitor the output because it likes to make things up and do its own thing as well. It's very much like an apprentice. But I think for me, in summing up what's going on with AI at the minute is just massively fragmented. People don't understand it. Like I said, they're using it as a tool when that's absolutely not what it is. And because of that, we're seeing really bad things happen when we've actually got the opportunity to make really good things happen with it if we design it in the right way. And that's kind of where fusion work comes into play.
I think you hit the nail on the head, like with this analogy of AI being an apprentice. It's only as good as the data that goes in, that
Hmm.
the data comes out. And then if you're thinking about a human is overseeing the data input, and if that human has bias, or the human that originally influenced the data set that's now feeding the LLM, and it could be a different human that's then using that information to, for example, screen CVs. And I was just reading, and you can correct me if any of the information I'm giving is not accurate, but about the EU AI Act. I think there's delays in releasing it. One of the elements is around not using AI to screen CVs, and I completely understand why. And actually, There's a piece that we're working on. We operate with a live skills ontology, but we don't enable AI to do screening. It's basic algorithms, so
Yeah.
we know that there's not a bias there. And then the AI we leverage to do the automation to kind of make the person faster, but
Mm.
it's ethical AI. So I guess my question is, there's a lot of organizations that are using AI right now for CV screening and other such things because they're available in the market. There
Mm.
isn't a law saying that they can't. They maybe are not aware of the bias that could be within their process flow and the fact that maybe people are being left out of being potentially considered. What would be your advice or recommendation for companies that are more conscious and going, where do we go for this information? How do we find out what we're doing is ethical?
See, I'm going to take you back a step because I feel like with this tool, like, so obviously companies have already got an HRIS in their organization, and these companies, these top technology vendors are now plugging AI into their solutions. It's a plaster. Again, it's another plaster on top of a plaster on top of a plaster with all of these solutions and these technologies. I would draw companies back to actually the underlying root cause of the inefficiencies within our organization and actually in how we design the roles again. Because if we're going to adopt AI ethically and we're designing automations ethically around outputs, then we really need to take that step back and actually start designing the roles to outcomes. Because at the moment, if you look at any job description that's out there, which is what you're going to feed into the AI, it's a list of tasks because that's historically how everybody's written the job description. And tasks and all of these things within these can and will at some point be done by AI. We also have data that suggests that 90% of the job descriptions out there don't actually reflect the roles of the people who are actually in role either. And it's like almost like exit interviews have fallen out of fashion, or actual reliable exit interviews have fallen out of fashion. Nobody's actually mapping what that role looks like at exit. So if we all we're doing is digging out the job description from 5 years ago and feeding that into AI, regardless of who its source is, it's not gonna be the role that that person's gonna actually do. We don't understand the skills or the representation that that role requires. Whoever ends up being hired for it is not gonna be able to come in and hit the ground running because they won't know what the role actually is because nobody's mapped it. So it's almost like if we want to sort of look at output, outcomes, if we want to look at task-based stuff, we really do need to take that big step back. So again, because organizations aren't designing this in properly, really before they start looking at ethics, before they start looking at skills, before they start looking at tasks that we need to look for in people's CVs, we really need to start thinking about, well, what actually is the role that's there? Has it already been part automated? Is the incumbent using ChatGPT or Perplexity or Grok or things within the role now, which would mean that actually they're going to spend more time doing the other things, the innovative things, the creative things, and stuff like that, rather than really going into a role that doesn't actually exist anymore. Because I think most people, if they looked at the job description based on what they do now, it will not share any semblance to the actual outputs and what they're actually delivering for that organization. And if you just think of the knock on impact of that, like how that impacts your salary, your ability to ask for more money, if your role is not right and somebody's mapping AI to that role, we've seen it in America, didn't we, when they did it in public sector. They let 6,000 people go and had to hire them all back a month later, exactly because the job descriptions that the AI had been mapped to weren't correct. They weren't aware of all of these other things that these people did, which is why that whole redundancy and the buying them all back in just absolutely failed. And like I said, AI is going to give us a real opportunity to do a proper reset, but it needs designing in properly. Bolting it on to our current systems is just going to exacerbate that decline because how we work is wrong and it's been wrong for quite a while. We need to get past these whole sticking plasters, which is when you look at AI as a tool, that's what that's causing. We need to get to the underlying root cause of how we work, why we work. Part of that is to earn as well. So that then presents itself with the whole host of macroeconomic issues that we all then need to contend with.
There are so many things that you just said, and I have multiple questions because a lot of the guests that come on the show, we're talking about, okay, how do we reskill, upskill? How do we help people understand where they can transfer their skills? And I'm very conscious that it might not just be leaders listening into the podcast. It could be people who've just been made redundant, people as well. But there's this sense that a leader has to be pretty brave because essentially what we're saying is if you're not brave enough to question the whole work job setup within the organization. And actually, we've realized we've a lot of intelligence within our system, but you kind of have to know how to use the system to extract the intelligence. So we're offering for organizations to do a skills AI readiness report so they can really understand, well, for every role, what element will require a human and what could be probably automated so you can start planning. But even I'm listening to what you're saying, it's like it's actually at the C-suite looking down. They have to go, hold on, blank piece of paper,
Yeah. Again,
redesigning. Where do you start?
I promise if we work the way when we get to January, there's a lot to do. I think the beauty of it, more than anything, is you can start with an individual role. You can start with the next role that comes up in your organization as long as you map it properly. So it can be incremental change. It doesn't have to be whole scale reset for those companies who are really risk averse. The issue is when you look from top down or bottom up, regardless of which way you go about it, the risk is actually maintaining the status quo and bolting on AI. That for me is the biggest risk to any organization right now. I'm trying to get to the point where instead of it being a traditional interview, when we go for things now, when talking to the people out there who listen to this podcast who, like you said, may have been made redundant or they're young looking for how to get into work, you want to be at a position where the interviewer is saying to you, show me how you're going to create this outcome for our organization. It becomes less about where you were educated. So if we just sign something to outcome, it's the outcome that then becomes important. So it's that show me how you're going to deliver this. So if you've done your learning by watching 10,000 hours of YouTube tutorials versus going to Oxford and paying all of that money for 4 years, actually how the substance of how you learn becomes less important. It becomes more about the deliverable, about the value that we create in an organization. And that is, to me, is a much more exciting interview and a much more exciting way of bringing people into our organizations than literally pushing out a list of task demands and having to show your qualifications or your work experience that shows you that you've got it. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's where when we see all of these CVs coming now that have been chatbotted to the nth degree, but it's because of how shoddy the job description is. So you're going to end up getting these nonsense CVs. And like I say, we end up with this mismatch, just why hiring is exorbitantly bad and, why organizations are automating because it's easier to automate and actually do the real work of HR, the real work of talent acquisition and look at what roles are in our organization that shouldn't be, which roles should be, which have we not even uncovered yet. We need to just start mapping everything. And like I say, you can do that one role at a time as it comes up in your organization, or you can do it department at a time. Like we do some stuff where we 2P teams out from organizations and we do that work for them and then they 2P them back in once the RADBOT approach, research, analysis, design, build, operate, transfer back in. And that is a really easy way to do it where the companies completely mitigate any risk because it's outside of their system and then it comes back in fully formed and functioning. So it doesn't have to be wholesale change at that top end for those companies that are more risk adverse. But there is definitely a top down view and there is a bottom up view when you look at fusion work and the organizations we really need to build for the future.
Quick question. Do you actually know what skills exist across your organizations today? Or are decisions still being made on job titles, CVs, and assumptions around who can be reskilled and upskilled? You see, as AI reshapes work and organizations really face that pressure to cut costs, the real challenge isn't just skills gaps. It's understanding which skills are transferable and which can be redeployed into the future with a bit of upskilling. So for the listeners of Global Skills Podcast, Abodu, our sponsor, has created this free Skills AI readiness assessment. It gives leaders clarity in just 3 minutes. It shows skills gaps, automation exposure, and where future-ready capabilities already exist within your business. No data upload, no preparation, just clarity for the future of your organization. Visit abodu.com/global skills podcast. Now, back to the episode.
So the role of learning and development in this changing world of work, what importance do you think that they play in ensuring that we're really future-proofing, not just the organization, but the people within it?
Massively important because we need to bring back that joy of learning. I feel like it just seems to go out of the window as soon as we leave school. Some people have lost love with the joy of learning long before they finish school. But I think L&D plays that important role in terms of that whole HR business. And I think, unfortunately, over the last few years, HR is very much just there. It's a department, it's a function, it's not strategic. And I think the opportunity that we have now for me, certainly as we adopt AI, as we adopt fusion work, is for HR to really take on that strategic mantle, and L&D will play a huge part within that because we've already identified the 4 human skill areas that cannot be automated away. So you've got your critical thinking, creative thinking, emotional intelligence, and leadership skills. And really, that's where L&D should be focusing all of their time and attention in terms of, okay, what creative thinking is required for these roles, what critical thinking, how do we enhance the people who are already in our organizations? Because I think one of the big things is as government do start looking at the impact of AI, certainly from a macroeconomic perspective, is how do we redeploy? How do we reskill? How do we ensure that humans remain employable in this new age, the age of AI? Because the real concern here is that people will just fall out of employment. And yes, governments will bring in an automation levy. That's bound to happen. I mean, we're looking at 2P reform already, and there's going to be a speaker session for MPs to drop in at Portcullis House in the next few weeks, specifically around 2P reform, where we'll be taking stuff back from technology vendors that are displacing people, but there will end up being an automation levy on companies that make redundancies without looking to redeploy. So I think L&D's responsibility and role in that is going to be paramount because they're really going to have their budgets increased. They're also going to have to look at how do they bring this joy of learning back into the organization, and how do you get people that have maybe done a lot of task-based roles, and how do we bring them into the era where they can use their ingenuity, their innovation, their creativity, the things that make us succinctly human? How do we bring that joy into our workplaces? And I think that is really the opportunity that AI brings, and that L&D really need to dig their fingers into and bring that back into our organizations.
You touched on a really good point there, actually, around the budget, because what I'm hearing again and again, and not necessarily in the episodes, but conversations, I suppose you could say they're off the record, is a lot of messages coming from C-suite down is, how do we cut heads? I think it's an awful term. And it's no longer how do we drop head count or how do we automate or how do we bring AI? It's literally how do we cut heads and grow revenue for 2026? So in that scenario, if a company's managers or leaders been told to cut heads, but that budget that's created as a result, because I don't think you can stop those decision makings if they're coming from higher above, or maybe you can, maybe you have advice for managers receiving that information. But in the event that they do have to cut and budgets created, are we sort of saying it's really important in the short term to reinvest in L&D and enable the remaining workforce to actually have skill development so that they're not part of the next head cut? I would love your thoughts on this, Cheney.
Again, I think we're just looking at things from a cluster again. These are all issues of legacy systems which are no longer fit for the age of AI, which goes along with our contracts. If all the time people are monetized by time, then the easy thing for C-suite shareholders to do is cut headcount because we're not being employed for the value creation that we provide. I bet a lot of us don't even know what value we do create within our organizations because our jobs are not designed that way. The whole time we are contracted by time, it's far too easy to cut us. So for me, L&D need to really push the fusion work agenda. They need to be looking at how we remap roles and be looking at the skills. Because I think once you've remapped it, it's much easier to see the skills that are required for that role as well. The whole time that they're monetized by time and they're task-based, all you're going to see when you look at that role is we can automate 60% of this. Because that was the biggest thing that came out of the findings, that 56 to 60% of every single person's role within an organization is automatable. So when you look at the people being monetized by time, well, actually, if 50% can be automatable, let's just grow our headcount by 50%. And that was what the Fusion Work Research interviews. It wasn't just about AI and its impact. It was like, look, we know this. This is a truth that is universal, that every HR person, every C-suite knows that 50 to 60% of every role can be cut. So the ethical question is, do we go for the short-term win? Do we take the redundancy hit now, but actually have the higher growth within our organization, which keep our shareholders happy? Or do we look at augmenting the talent that we have and get that longer term growth, but we've augmented our talent, we've remapped, we've reskilled, and we're investing in our people? And I think that will always be the decision makers of some C-suites over others. And that comes down to not being legislation there. It comes down to governance. It comes down to ethics and morality. But I wrote an article in the last week on Henry Ford and what he understood that people within the AI space are not understanding, and what C-suites aren't understanding is that if you start removing the ability for people to pay for stuff, you're essentially self-harming. And we're entering this period of corporate self-harm at the minute. Because look at Amazon, how many people did they let go last week? 14,000 people? That's 14,000 potential Amazon customers who can now no longer afford to pay for stuff or to buy, to utilize Amazon Prime. So yes, they've cut an immediate headcount, creating all of that saving. But actually, what's the longer term impact? If those people cannot find jobs elsewhere, they've also lost 14,000 customers to Amazon and its services. And when that gets then replicated out globally to millions of people being displaced, AI, that growth is just going to completely decimate the other side of the loop, which is somebody's got to be out there to buy our products and services. And if those people are no longer employed, they don't have any money to put back into close that loop. So, creating your own customers, people just don't seem to be thinking about that yet. That for me feels quite fundamental and quite obvious that actually, if we don't have people in our organizations anymore, how are we generating the wealth for people to buy our products and services? And that just seems to be something that's glaringly obviously being missed.
Could it be argued that can supercharge with AI productivity and therefore the prices can come down and we make them more affordable, even if people are not working and they're on a universal income?
But how can you raise taxes if nobody's working? PAYE is the biggest area of tax reclamation for the UK government. It would only take 14% of middle income earners at that 40k mark to fall out of employment for our whole tax system in the UK to fall over. That means no more free schools, no more NHS. So it can't be as blasé as that. There is not going to be a universal basic income because we'll be lucky if we can have our basic services that we currently take for granted, even subsidized in any way, shape or form. It's going to be a very different economy that we're stepping into if we're not making some of these changes right now.
And I'm sure some listeners might be thinking, well, there's a clock here.
Yeah, there is a clock.
So how long do we have?
So what everybody keeps saying, by 2030 we'll have achieved this. I think there's so many things that can happen by 2030 that would be, and I don't want to be alarmist. I'd really like organizations to understand that actually AI adoption can be this amazing thing. But if they don't and they keep going as they are, we're going to have some major issues. When you were introducing me about the work I'm doing around ESG and that needing to be a fourth pillar, which is workforce sustainability. And that needs to be a really, really big pillar in my mind because it really taps into the other three areas because AI is brilliant, but it eats a lot of energy, eats a lot of resources. So then you've got, that will have an impact on ESG. It will have an impact on companies who claim to be B Corp. As they start automating roles, that's more and more energy they're subsuming. And that again has a knock-on impact. So you've got all of these charters and things that they need to achieve by 2030, 2040. Not going to happen because of the use of AI. So then you get into the question, well, actually, can they adopt AI ethically and still hit ESG targets? Probably not to the extent that they want to. And then obviously there's the impact on, we've talked sort of very high level on the macroeconomic in terms of people falling out of work if their jobs are not redesigned to outcomes, and we keep persisting with this time-based economy that we all have and how we work. There's just so many other areas that I'm probably missing about 20 other things that I could say at this point. But I think in terms of that timeline, it's going to happen fast because unfortunately this is happening at machine speed. And, people have that whole mantra, well, we've already been through this with the Industrial Revolution. It created as many jobs as it displaced, but it's how long the displacement lasts for if we're not designing this stuff in properly. And for me, that displacement could last 5 years, which means by the time they realize that how they're working is broken, by the time you're starting to build back or doing the reset that's required, say in 5 years' time, we're going to be building back from crumbling ground. You know what I mean? Our whole society will change. We're already seeing it within the rise of populism and things like that because of the economic uncertainty that's surrounding everything. We've had 39 months of GDP remaining stagnant or growing, but we know that there's two people out there for every role. The roles are just not being created for the last 39 months. And which means GDP is already uncoupled from job creation. The economy is going up, but actually that's not actually coming from jobs. So all of these things are like huge red flags that nobody seems to be piecing together as to actually what are the long-term impacts there. And that sounded really negative. So I'm sorry, everybody, but there is a pathway. I promise it doesn't have to be negative if we take the steps now.
Cheney, I think you've done a really good job of articulating, like, if we just sit on our hands and do absolutely nothing, this is what's going to be ahead. But there are some amazing leaders listening. And if they're coming from government, education, or industry, what can they do? I know we've tapped into maybe that next role that they're creating. They redesign it, they start the redesign in baby steps. But if they want to do more at a local level or within government, what can they do? Because I think at the end of the day, we're not AI, we're humans, we have hearts. Many of us have children, we're thinking about the next generation. We don't want to be handing over crumble. We want to be handing over something that's, we really thought things through with all the
Yeah.
experience that we have that are beyond LLMs. We were able to redesign at the time. So any words of wisdom as to what we can do?
Yeah, I mean, all of this is about legacy, right? I think you've just summed it up there really, really clearly. And get involved. I mean, speak to us at Bloor because we're quite happy to have conversations with everyone because obviously we've got the Fusion Work white paper that comes out in January, which is a really useful guide for organizations, for HR. It's designed to help anybody who wants to just have that different narrative. So it's been written for people who write policy, for the unions, for business leaders, for employees themselves, or for future of workists. So that will be a really good grounding, I think, just for people to understand actually the scale of sitting on our hands and doing nothing. Get involved in your APPGs, make sure you're raising red flags to MPs and to other leaders in your local area in terms of actually, this is a conversation worth having and let's have it now. Because the biggest thing to fall out of all of the fusion work research, and I think everybody who participated on it will agree, that it's time for a reset. This is not time for reform. Transformation is tinkering at the edges. It's what we've been doing for the last 10 years. When we look at flexible working, DEI, all of the other really good work that people have been doing, it has been tinkering at the edges because the system itself it's trying to fix is broken. So for me, it has to be that reset and start having those reset conversations. And whether that means doing it incrementally from the next job that comes up in your organization, or whether it's wholesale change and just saying, sod it, it's the etch a sketch, end of the world, we're redesigning from scratch. That's what we need to do. And Bloor Research, Richard, myself, Donna, we're all here to speak to people about the potential for their organizations and how we can all move forward.
And I think it truly is an amazing opportunity to set the bar as a business or even as a higher education institution. Instead of watching unemployment rates rising for young people and thinking, well, how can we make cuts? In Asia, they're very good, aren't they, at looking 5, 10, 15, 20 years
Yeah.
ahead. And maybe that's what we need to do in the
We
West.
don't do that politically, do we? Because we've got 4 or 5 years of the same some governments, it's all short-term thinking, and what we need is long-term planning. We need to future-proof ourselves, and that's gonna take some courage from government because it won't necessarily be their government that get the end result. It could be their opposition, their opponent, and I don't want to get into a political debate because I could talk about that all day long and people won't like me. I think that when we see the changes implemented by authoritarian sort of countries and things like that, that's something that they get to do because that's what they get to do. When unfortunately we're not led like that here, it has to be, a lot of chefs stood around that soup pot giving it a good stir, and there's reasons to do it, there's reasons not to do it. But for me, it comes down to short-term or long-term thinking and whether or not actually as a government we want to leave a lasting legacy. Labour's done it before with the NHS. If they step up to the mark and they're backing this fusion work research, the APPG for Modernising Employment is going to be there with us when we launch fusion work. It's their opportunity to really set out a bold vision for the future and really changing work once and for all.
We have a closing tradition to the podcast where I ask 2 questions, but you only have to answer 1.
Okay.
Question 1, is there a skill that you have from when you were younger that you don't use anymore that you'd like to use again? And if so, why? Question 2, if you are a young person listening today and you're thinking, what skills do I need? Or what's the top skill that I really need to focus on developing? What advice would you give to them?
I'm going to answer the second one purely because I'm forever doing this with B, Eliza, and Harry. So my kids are 11, 9, and 6. And all I'm trying to instill in them is the joy of learning, how to reference and fact check things that you've read or you've seen, encourage people to be creative. Like I'm a real meanie. I tell the kids' teachers that they're not doing homework, which is I think is fine whilst they're in junior and primary education. But I don't want them to come in and have to learn. I want them to come in and use what they've learned and create and really look at those critical thinking, creative thinking, emotional intelligence, leadership, all of these things, like do stuff that you're passionate about and don't let that go. I think something that certainly probably happens to all of us while we were in work, you leave school where you're learning 8, 9, 10 things a day. being in an environment where you're doing the same thing every day for the next 20 years, like that's not what work needs to be about. It needs to be about innovation, around joy, around creativity. And I think if we harness that whilst we're young and we really adopt that joy of learning, when we take that into work, make sure you do take it into work and be that person. And hopefully by the time that you're joining the workforce, we'll have done our job, which is going to be our legacy, which is going to convert everything from time-based to outcome-based working, and you'll have a much nicer time in employment than we did when we joined.
We'll end on that high. Cheney, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I think I'm going to take away the fact that you've definitely painted a very stark view of if we do nothing. And I don't think I've fully appreciated just how stark it is. But at the same time, there's just this hope. And I love the background that you have because you have like is it the sun or the moon coming up?
I don't know. It's my head is where the sun is. So there you go.
And
Maybe that's symbolic.
I feel that. I really believe if you're listening today and a little light bulb has gone off in your head and you are thinking as a business leader, right, we need to redesign. I'll make sure we've Cheney's links below the episode today. If you're thinking, well, I just want an analysis or report, again, you can reach out to us. Happy to do that too. But I think we need to take the reins on this as definitely as leaders and feel brave to take the first few steps. Inertia will not be good in this situation I'm taking from today. So Cheney, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Whether you're leading a business, shaping education, planning your next career move, or just starting out, you're part of a global conversation about how we learn, work, and grow. If you've enjoyed this episode, tap subscribe so you never miss the latest insights. And if you've a moment, leaving a quick rating really helps people find the show. For early access to new episodes, event invitations, and the chance to connect with others driving real change, join the community at globalskillspodcast.com. The future of skills belongs to all of us. Proudly sponsored by Abodu, empowering organisations and educators with world-class skills technology to build a better future for everyone.